Hello, everyone. I'm going to do some recordings here for you today to get some of the material out for our class on assessment and some things that we want to be thinking about. The first thing that I want to emphasize, and you can see this on the screen right now, is that the materials that I'm using today, a bunch of them I made using AI. So Midjourney is a bot inside of Discord, and Discord is a communication platform. And this is a subscription service, so I paid like $10 a month for this right now because I'm using it a lot. And I've been able to use it to make a lot of instructional materials that are kind of tailored to what I want. But I've also not been able to make a lot of the things because I've been exploring the limitations of what visual AI can do, mostly because it only knows what it has in its database, and its database consists of images, videos, and often the tags and the metadata that go along with those. So it's not super good, and I think I've mentioned this before, it's not super good at making a mental model of what language would usually make for us. So like when we put the relationships between nouns and verbs and adjectives together in a sentence, we pay close attention to the relationships between those words so that we know how the pieces and parts of what we're talking about look and feel together. And the skill that this is a comprehension skill. It's like being able to put together language like that and make a mental model that's roughly accurate, and then being able to ask questions and clarify to get more accurate with that. Anyway, that's something that I find that the AI bots for visualization cannot do well, is that they don't handle those relationships. I just give it some tags, some keywords. It goes into its database and it pulls the pieces and parts and puts them together in a way that matches its sense of what a 2D piece of art should look like in composition. So it has its limitations. Anyway, the reason that I was using the AI today is that I wanted to take us on a walk through history and to think about what it means to know and to be and to do. And we want to ask those questions. What does it mean to know things? What does it mean to be in the time and place that we're in? And what does it mean to be able to do things? All of these things are elements of competence. And we're always talking about some form of competence when we're talking about assessment. And sometimes that involves declarative knowledge, sometimes it involves being able to do things, and sometimes it involves being able to be in the world and function in a particular way. So assessment depends on answering the questions about knowledge and being and doing. So what I asked AI to do for me was I asked the Midjourney bot to make for me different visuals of historical and cultural settings. And I'm just kind of scrolling through some of these that you can see here. The key things that I wanted to see is that I wanted to see what would it look like to imagine ourselves being in a setting hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, and so on, as compared to today. And then in addition to having that sort of historical walk through time to see all of these different places, I also did a clear switch between urban and rural as a cut across those different segments of time. So I'm going to kill my, well, I won't kill Midjourney. I'll just bring up my preview here and we'll start looking at these images. So what you see here is a typical AI image of what I asked for a complex urban setting. So I'm going to scroll through some of these settings and you'll see what I have here. I'll start with this one because I asked it to build a place with a library, shopping, and restaurants, because I think this is the kind of place that many of us are familiar with today as a typical place that we would experience in today's world. You could walk into a shopping center and see sometimes a library. There's one right here in Fort Collins where you walk in and there's a library, there's restaurants, there's other shops and so on. So what does it mean to know things if you're trying to take care of things, to be competent in this setting? What do you have to know and be able to do? What do you have to think about when you walk into a library? What do you have to understand? What do you have to navigate? What do you have to do to get food? What do you have to do to make purchases and so on? And this sort of bustling urban scene, or even suburban scene, does not look that different from, let's just go to, this is the AI image I asked it to make of an ancient Mesopotamian trading port or something like that. I can't remember what the exact words were, but you can see it still looks like a busy place. You could probably get food here. You could probably buy and sell things. But what it means to be competent and to be able to do things is very different in these two settings. For example, if you look at all of the boats here, in this ancient trading place, there are very specific people who have to be competent with boats. And in the setting that you're looking at, let's just think about this. If you work with a boat, one of the key skills that you have to have is to be able to secure the boat when you come up to the port. And security, if you are a boat owner, is almost entirely about rope and knowing how to do things with rope. And I'd like you to stop and think about that. How much do you really know in an expert way how to do with rope? So knots and rope types and thicknesses and the things that they're made of and repairing them and who has the best ropes, all of those kinds of things, those are super important to you if you live in this society. And then let's just skip back to this. In this modern place with the library, shopping centers, and restaurants, do people have to know much about rope? Certainly not. What does constitute security in a situation like this? Knowing and being and doing in a scenario like this, most of the people in this setting, the security of their things, their property, their self, is mostly going to be tied up with the security of their phone. And the phone isn't shown here, but this is a modern setting, and most of the people in this are going to be depending on their phone. I depend on my phone even in library situations. I have my library card, barcode, and so on my phone. So even if I'm getting hard copies of books, I'm involving my phone to take care of the security there. And it's not showing all of these things, but we know our way around a library, don't we? You see all of those books in the background there. We've got the security codes, the security tags, so people just don't walk out with a library book. And are those same magnetic security tags also going to be on items in the shops? Yeah. So think about that. Ropes were important in the old days, and today phones and magnetism are super important to us. So I'm going to stop you right there and think about that. Do you know how the signals for your phone work? Do you actually know how radio works in the way that wireless phones use? So that's a key piece of knowledge that's actually shaping everything that we do. And there are very few people, a kind of an elite group of people, I think, who kind of understand how wireless communication actually works. And to be honest, how radio waves actually work. Have you ever stopped and actually sit down to think about who came up with the idea of radio waves to begin with? They're invisible waves. And I remember reading about, I think James Clerk Maxwell is one of the key physicists back in the early 1800s who began to discover the idea that there were radio waves out there. And the story I remember reading most was that either he or somebody that he knew as an amateur scientist had a little hut that was filled with different kinds of cases filled with magnets and iron filings. And he would set up the iron filings a particular way to be able to come and do experiments with them. And he would walk out the next morning and the iron filings would be in completely different places than he had put them. And he started to think there must be magnetism, some sort of magnetism all around us that's messing this up, because nobody came in here and did anything with magnets to change the position of these iron filings. And so some of these early experiments with magnets and so on began to give people the idea that, yes, magnets clearly have an invisible force, but there are invisible forces swirling all around us that we can't see because we can only see with our eyes and hear with our ears, and these are limited instruments. So to know and do and be, our measurements of competence are very different age to age. And I'd like you to think about that even in the old days. Sorry, that's not what I wanted to do. Even in an ancient setting, what does it mean to live inland in a rural village compared to living in a bustling seaport where it's going to be fairly urbane and complicated and have people of different types and so on close to each other? My understanding from talking to historians over the years is that most people who lived in village life in this kind of an old setting, that their entire world was within about 1 mile, that most people never went further than 1 or 2 miles away from the little center of their village, and that it was considered very strange and weird if you were actually with somebody who went out to other villages and came back, and maybe dangerous. So security, in a lot of ways, has to do with, in this situation, has to do with your group, who you are and who is an insider and who is an outsider. And that's thinking and feeling that we still have today. So let's just look at a couple more here. So even in modern times, let's get to this. This is an image that I asked it to make of a complex rural factory town. Instead of having it be agrarian. I made it specifically this way because some of our recent research on rural children's literature, we've found that only about 10 or 11% of the people that work in rural areas actually have a career in agriculture. Most of the other people work in some kind of service or other industry that might be there. And in many rural areas, you're talking about a single industry town, especially further back east and also, in places like Wyoming. Single industry towns are fairly common. So think about this. If you're looking at this sort of warehouse, putting goods together, moving them to a place where they'll get transported and so on, what does it mean to be and know and do in a setting that's like this compared to an urban setting? So in today's world, complex, even if it's I think I've got thought I had a rural agrarian. Let me just pull that up here. Got all my images right here. Complex rural, yeah, here's one that's a little bit more agrarian and maybe a little bit more utopian. This is probably what most of us imagine when we think of a rural area, kind of a Charlotte's Web, the Red Barn, the farmhouse, the 4-H club, all of those kinds of things. And that's definitely a true image of rurality, but it's only a single slice through what rural life means. So what does it mean to know and be and do if you do happen to be involved with rural life? And I think about that a lot because we went to the rodeo in Cheyenne this past summer, and it was really striking me that all of this work with horses in a rodeo is very abstract and kind of Baroque in a lot of ways, in that we have all of these trappings that go along with horses and horse life when the use of horses is no longer practically necessary. So it's this form of nostalgia, almost like ballet or opera, where we take these old forms and these old practices and we continue to carry them forward to celebrate the way things were, but also that there's this sort of arcane, specialized knowledge that you get from being around and taking care of horses, which has some intrinsic and transferable value out in the world. My son has done horse therapy, hippotherapy for many years, and gets great benefit from doing his occupational therapy and other things when there's a large animal like a horse involved. So to say that agrarian life in many ways is abstract or arcane is not to devalue it, but to say it's a really interesting sort of human thing that we do. And it's not meaningful for everybody, and not everybody has access to it. So the kids who do 4-H and are able to raise and take care of a pig, that's a really interesting and a different skill than what you're going to think about if you think about this modern urban setting or this suburban shopping mall sort of a setting. I'm going to pull myself up a little bit further here and just talk a little bit more about the rest of the things that are important to this. One of these things, when we think about being and knowing and doing, a key thing that we think about when we're talking to people to learn about them is that we listen closely for their accents. And I brought this up in class by saying that I had a student back in the 1990s who moved to Michigan from Texas. And we were, I can't remember what exactly the setting was, but he said, "I'd like some pie." And all three of those words were things where I was thinking, he just said, "I'd like some pie." And he said, instead of I. And I really noticed his accent at that point, and I started to pay attention to that through the late 1990s and the early 2000s as assessments began to actually look for phonemic awareness, the ability of students to attend to those little single sounds that they use in speech. And I found that every time I was working with a student who came from a different region of the United States, I had to be aware whether they were pronouncing words differently. And not just regions, families actually do things like this that they pass down from generation to generation. One of the ones that I noticed growing up and started to see among my students was that some people say pillow instead of pillow. Some people say milk instead of milk. I know that in Michigan, a lot of people take that short O sound and they make it into a clear flat ah sound. So in the summertime, people I know from Michigan, especially people who are from up north, like Traverse City or the Upper Peninsula, will say it's hot outside, hat, instead of hot. And that sort of rounded O sound that we have is flattened in the Northwest, or the Midwest up to the north. I think it used to be called the Northwest back in the old days. Anyway, what it means to know and be and do has a lot to do with how we talk, and that's getting assessed and thought about all around us. In these ancient villages that you're looking at, if somebody came in and spoke with an accent that was different, that would be a clear sign of danger for those people in that medieval European village. It's like, who are you and why are you talking that way? And what do you want from us? What are your intentions? And so on. So the strangeness of an accent is actually something that over hundreds and thousands of years has become a sign for us of somebody coming from outside. And that hits us right in the amygdala. Not in the cerebral cortex as much as that area deep in your brain that's checking, is this a risky situation or a safe situation for me? As far as assessment goes, on a personal level, that amygdala is the core of your assessing world. It's constantly checking for you over and over again. Am I safe or am I in danger? Are there risks or there are benefits? And we are able to take some of those emotional responses, and we've created an emotional system that's fairly abstract. We have names for all of these feelings that we have that are either about risk or safety. And they're not just sort of that jellyfish-like response. Jellyfish actually have something like a proto-amygdala, and it's the one thing that we share with almost all of the basic forms of life that know how to get what they want but get away when they're in danger. So the amygdala is actually really fundamental for me in thinking about all of learning and assessment, because it governs whether or not we're going to engage and how we're going to engage and so on. So accents. Regional accents actually have a lot to do with judgments that we make about people and things in English. And interestingly, over the past 50 years, the linguist William Labov has been measuring the gradual disappearance of regional Englishes, that in the United States, things are progressively becoming more like Western English. So, and it's often called, when we're teaching world languages, it's often called newscaster English. So it's the English that tends to be the preferred accent among movie stars, TV hosts, that type of thing. So we often see people with accents in modern media, movies and TVs and popular music and so on. They're given an accent to give them a sense of quaintness or regionality that makes them into an interesting, colorful character. So you don't often see somebody in a movie speaking with sort of an old Brooklyn accent, a Bugs Bunny kind of an accent, unless they're trying to make them into a character side character of interest or something like that. Or if they're a main character, to actually pique our interest in the fact that they are from someplace that is unique. So think about that. Accents actually have a lot to do with the way we treat people and think about people. And it's just one of the things that I think about when we're thinking about assessment. Beyond regional accents, world Englishes are a huge thing in our English-speaking society, because people in Africa, India, different spots in Asia, such as Singapore and Hong Kong, Australia, New Zealand, all of those areas. These are places where English is the main language for many of these areas, and the accents that they speak with in their arena, in their regional areas, is perfectly normal to them. But in the United States, we tend to notice those and think about them less as variations on the same language as the idea that the person is foreign. So the idea of an accent is actually one of the things that contributes to our othering sense, and that comes from what I was talking about before, which is that our old cultural lives tended to be governed by, are we safe or are we at risk? And an accent in speaking has been one of those signals that we've used over thousands of years to mark whether someone is with us or outside of us. Couple of things that come up to me for that, facts that I've learned over the years. One is that accent is actually the only thing that they've discovered that there's a critical period for in learning language. There's this myth that's out there that actually came from newspaper articles over 30 or 40 years ago. I think it was in the early 1980s that an article in a newspaper was published, or a magazine, that said that there was a critical period for learning language and that you couldn't really learn languages unless you had learned them by the age of 5 or 12 or something like that. Researchers over the years have studied that and watched it really closely, and of course that was actually just a meme. It was a myth that was propagated by the media that never actually had much of a scientific basis behind it. As researchers have examined that more closely, they've found that the one thing that people are unlikely to actually develop after the ages of like 5, 7, 8, 9, up until age 12, if you don't get that accent that sounds like an insider for your region or area of the world, you probably won't ever sound perfectly like the people in that region. Just because you won't be able to hear and perceive the subtle differences that make somebody an insider versus an outsider. So that's fascinating to me. We've talked about that critical period for learning language, but we didn't stop to think about how that myth actually helped us learn over the years that the accent is the one thing that there's actually a critical period for, and that accent is actually more about your sense of wanting to learn and pay attention to being an insider. And I think that young people are really in tune to the little nuances of what it means to be an insider versus an outsider. And many adults have this abstract thinking that allows them to sort of embrace themselves as the outsider and not worry so much about sounding perfectly like everybody else around them. So interesting stuff to think about in assessment, right? Think about this. If you think about the time periods, rural versus urban, all of these distinctions that we have in social and historical context. In your context of education, what does it mean to be and know and do, and where did that come from? What are the historical facts that shaped what that is and made it what it is today? And what are the cultural lines that draw across it to shape what it is from place to place and context to context? The last thing that I wanted to mention regarding language is that back in 1992, I went to my first American Educational Research Association conference, and it was in New Orleans. It was a wonderful first conference to go to. I happened to be able to hear the linguist Robert E. Scholes talk about his research on grammar, and it was such an arcane, weird little session for there to be at AERA, but the research that he was presenting was fascinating because what he did was he showed samples of language that demonstrated that in United States English that there is a separate and distinct grammar for spoken language than there is. Oh, my computer just stopped on me. I hope we're still recording. A separate and distinct grammar for written language than there is for spoken language. So oral language English has its own grammar, written language has its own grammar. One of the key things that this brings up for us as teachers is that if you listen to English teachers especially, we tend to try to correct children's language to make their speech sound more like written language. We think that that's correct language. And what Robert Scholes found in his research was, no, there are two separate buckets here, two separate registers. You have a register for written English that makes you choose your relationships in your speaking and your word order and everything this way, whereas when you are talking, you have a completely different way of doing that. And I'll give them some examples. I think that it's really frequent for us to not know what to say, whether it's me and I. So when we start a sentence with me and Dan went to the concert the other day, that's going to sound incorrect to someone who's thinking of spoken English. Sorry, of written English, because in written English, we want to be very clear about the I being the subject in that sentence. But oftentimes in spoken languages, we cut off bits and pieces of the language that we assume people will understand. And in a sentence like, excuse me, in a sentence like me and Dan went to the concert, when I'm telling somebody else about that, there's sort of an implicit bird's eye view of this where you're saying, if you would have been there, you would have seen me and Dan. So there's this sense that, okay, I'm talking about myself as this other person, and it becomes more appropriate for us to say that. And sometimes it's appropriate that way, and sometimes it's just the way we do things in spoken language. In some areas of the United States, it's fully appropriate for somebody to say, we was watching TV the other night. And to just use was as a single thing instead of always worrying about parsing out the agreement of the verb with the subjects in a sentence. There are languages worldwide that don't have to have that kind of agreement, and I think in many cases people simplify the English language, sometimes based on where they come from, that idea of we was doing something. Scandinavian languages, it's we was, you was, I was, he was, plural, doesn't matter. It's the same verb in Scandinavian languages. English in the United States was influenced by many Scandinavian immigrants and immigrants from other countries as well. So I want you to think about that. Written versus spoken grammar, we tend to assess correctness based on the idea that written language is privileged, and to sound correct and appropriate, you must sound like a book. So just bring back some of the images, make myself small again. What does it mean to be and know and do in different time periods and in different locations, different contexts, and so on? And just to bring us back to the idea that artificial intelligence is a new thing that's emerging, that's becoming part of the historical context of our world. And I'd like you to be playing with it. I'd like you to figure out what you can learn about what AI does, what it can't do, what the algorithms are designed to do, and what sort of affordances and constraints it has, what it means for us. So I'll stop there, and we'll post this video for you in class. Bye-bye.